At the bedrock of our politics will be a total allegiance to the United States of America. And through our loyalty to our country, we will rediscover our loyalty to each other. When you open your heart to patriotism, there is no room for prejudice. Whether we are black or brown or white, we all bleed the same red blood of patriots. We will reinforce old alliances and form new ones and unite the civilized world against radical Islamic terrorism, which we will eradicate completely from the face of the earth. Your voice, your hopes, and your dreams will define our American destiny. And your courage and goodness and love will forever guide us along the way. Together, we will make America strong again. We will make America wealthy again. We will make America proud again. We will make America safe again. And yes, together, we will make America great again. Thank you, God bless you, and God bless America.
The Trump effect is what I think is the deprogramming of the American mind. And I think Donald Trump's election was really electing the deprogrammer in chief. And I think there's been a lot of misunderstanding about Trump and a lot of fear about Trump. And some of the fear mongering has been intentional, but I think there's also been a lot of misunderstanding about who he is, where he comes from, and what he's trying to do. And I think if we really understand the Trump effect, we'll understand that rather than having any reason to be fearful of a Trump presidency, we have a great opportunity to be happy that we're going to have a president who's going to enable us to relax and not be feared. Because in fact, we've been living in fear, in my opinion, since September 11th, 2001. And the destruction of the World Trade Center, the attack on the Pentagon, showed America is terribly vulnerable despite spending trillions of dollars on national defense. And there has been no successful response in over 15 years. And Trump, coming from New York City, represents the very geographical location which came to symbolize 9/11. And coming from the construction industry, obviously represents the very industry that was most affected by 9/11. He builds high office towers and hotels and giant monumental buildings, and that's what was attacked by our enemies, Al-Qaeda, on 9/11. So I think his running for president is symbolic, it's personal. He's from New York. He's not really a traditional Republican. He was a Democrat most of his life. He's not a born-again Christian. He's some kind of moderate Presbyterian. He's been married several times. He's certainly not a racist. He had Muhammad Ali at one of his weddings. He had Michael Jackson living in his building. By any normal evaluation, a New York liberal on the liberal end of the spectrum. As far as being anti-gay, you can see, as somebody joked on the internet, just from the way Trump Tower is decorated, that he must know some gay decorators. So that there's no question that he's not a bigot, he's not a racist, he's not a homophobe, he's not an Islamophobe. He himself says he has Muslim business partners. He has projects in Muslim countries. He's not an isolationist. When people say, oh, Trump is an isolationist, they fail to say that his hotel chain is called Trump International Hotels. He's got an international business which operates internationally. You can't be an internationalist and an isolationist at the same time. So one after another, the misconceptions about Trump need to be dispelled. And I think people really have to realize what Trump is most of all is a realist. And until now, I'd say from 9/11 to now, the country has been living under a series of fantasies and not had a realistic leader, whether it was President Bush, whether it was President Obama. Trump represents a realist approach, a non-ideological approach, when we previously had ideologues of various stripes. And so that's why I want to say, in my opinion, because Scott Adams says he's the hypnotist in chief, and others say the persuader in chief. But I think what's important is his role to me as a deprogrammer, because I think Americans have somehow been programmed, indoctrinated, sort of fed a lot of fantasy ideology, whether in schools, whether in the media, whether in their politics. And he represents a non-ideological, practical approach that is very much in keeping with a New York business background. It's very much in keeping with, funnily enough, a tradition of the old Democratic Party pre-1968. And I think you can explain a lot of what he's doing by looking at those non-programmed aspects of his person. In other words, he's not programmed, he is who he is. And that's what's so interesting. He's never worked for anybody else. It's always been the family company or himself. He's never lived in anybody else's property until now. I mean, I think he may have had an apartment in New York, but they didn't know. But basically, he's lived in Trump properties until now. And so, just paradoxically, he was the right man at the right time because he wasn't cumbered by all the restraints other people had. He didn't have to go through pleasing bosses. He didn't have to go through pleasing superiors. He could do what he wanted to do the way he wanted to do it, which is really very much of an individualistic approach that Americans used to have. That was American individualism. That was Yankee know-how, Yankee ingenuity. And he sort of embodies that pre-1960s tradition of America. And hopefully he will be able to break the spell that we've been living under, because until now I think we've been subject to a lot of misconceptions. Why do I say deprogrammer in chief? Because if you look at the literature on indoctrination, mind control, brainwashing, and so forth, you find that the techniques Trump's using are the same techniques used by deprogrammers. First, they have to discredit the cult leader. If somebody's following a cult, I don't want to specify any particular cult, but the deprogrammer, they take the person away from the cult, they usually put them in a safe house or whatever, and they first try to discredit the leader by telling you terrible things about the leader. Well, he did it with the Clintons, and he did it with the Bushes, both. And he did it with President Obama, where you personally discredit the leader. The second step is then you show the contradictions between what they say and what they're going to do on a policy or action level. So again, he did that. And I think that's where the tweets come in. He's constantly showing you some contradiction over and over and over again, bombarding the public with this information, part of a deprogramming strategy. The third stage, and which is the tipping point in this, is that you have to get the cult member who's being deprogrammed to recognize reality. In other words, the cult creates a fantasy world that you live in. Once the cult follower is shown the leader can't be trusted, that the policies make no sense, and then is exposed to what reality is, the former cult person can begin to think for him or herself. And so Trump has really been carrying out this experiment in deprogramming the whole country because, frankly, we have been fed a lot of fantasies up until now, since 9/11, which was a tremendous trauma. No one knew how to deal with it. People couldn't face reality, whether you had Bush saying Islam is peace, everyone wants democracy, we're going to go and it's going to be like the Wicked Witch of the West, and they're going to sing The Witch is Dead, and everyone's going to live happily ever after, which didn't happen. Trillions of dollars for that. Or you had Barack Obama saying equally unrealistic things about he would pull out the troops and the world would see we're not anti-Islam, so then everyone would be nice to us. That didn't happen either. I think Trump goes, let's just deal with things as they are. Let's find out what's really going on and try and isolate the problems and fix them. Because this is what you do. If you're building and the HVAC doesn't work, you got to go and find the compressor out and replace it, and then it can work again. So I think that practical approach is something that is very real. That's where we are now. He's trying to get the country to face reality. And I think there's this resistance. It's funny, the term is resistance. The originators of it, of course, were thinking of the French Revolution, French resistance to the Nazis. But in fact, you could argue there's a psychological dimension to resistance. Because in psychotherapy, there's a stage of resistance where the adolescent is resisting facing reality. And so what you have, everyone in the resistance is actually resisting reality. They don't want reality, because reality is much scarier than the fantasy world, because it means America does have enemies. It means there are economic problems. It means there is violence in the inner cities. All these things that you've sort of ignored or wished away or denied are right there, and you have to confront them. Trump says we can fix them. But first you have to realize what the problems are before they can be fixed. So this resistance is actually an interesting word, because it tells you a lot about the psychology of Trump's opposition as well as of Trump's himself. They're almost adapting to his role as deprogrammer by resisting him. So Trump's role will be to overcome this resistance. Once the resistance is overcome, his opponents can recognize reality, then people can work together, I believe, fix the problem. So I'm personally optimistic if he can get through this bumpy non-honeymoon period and actually begin working to solve problems. I think it could be a very productive presidency, because he's non-ideological, he's not really right-wing, he's not really a Republican, practical result oriented. He's not Hitler. Everything he's done has been purely democratic. If anything, the other side, with riots, disruptions, has been behaving more like Nazis. So I think we'll see step by step. The Trump effect is going to be very powerful. We've already seen it. The Trump effect at the border, where illegal immigration is already down just in a few days, just by him being elected. We've seen the stock market is up again, just by being elected. That's the Trump effect. And I assume this effect will continue as we go forward. I'm hoping that it won't be too difficult at deprogramming. But that's what we're really talking about, the difference between coming out of a fantasy world and moving into a world of reality. And if anything, Trump is a very realistic figure, at least in my perception, not having met him. But I come from New York City, and I've seen his buildings. And I think it's interesting what's happening is the New York values he talks about are real values. I mean, it's interesting when that came up in the debate, Cruz tries to use against Trump to work for Trump. It's a shame that the people in New York are more loyal to their ideology, to their fantasy, and to their political delusions than they are to geography and history, which would say root for the home team. We've got a New Yorker in the White House. People from New York should support him just as rooting for the home team. So that'll be interesting to see if he can pull that off by the next election, because that's traditionally you root for the favorite son. And if there's one thing about Trump, he's really from New York. Another thing about Trump, which is interesting, is he sort of represents the un-university. I mean, they say he got a lot of working class support. People who are not highly educated support him. But what that means is people who were not indoctrinated. Since 1968, the universities have pretty much become a closed shop. Alan Bloom wrote The Closing of the American Mind in 1987, complaining about what's happening in the universities. And certainly in the last few years, any of the old curmudgeonly professors who were individualists have disappeared, and you have basically a cadre who came of age in the 60s and believed the Weathermen or the Black Panthers or the FALN or Fidel Castro, Che Guevara, Yasser Arafat, you name it. They believe the purpose of the university is to promote the revolution, and they believe that communism is good. I was at a talk at a bookstore in Washington by a novelist who wrote a book about Sunnyside, New York in Queens, which is a communist neighborhood, and it had been reviewed by a Chinese-American refugee from communism who said, oh, this is a great book because it shows how frightening communists are. And so he said in his talk, oh, I don't want anyone to think that there's anything wrong with communism at all. And so that's basically the gestalt, I think, in American universities at the highest level, that there are very few people who are willing to say there's anything wrong with communism at all. Luckily, Trump spent his whole life in the construction industry. He doesn't have any problem saying there's something wrong with communism or any other totalitarian ideology. And so what you're seeing now is, for the first time, somebody who has no particular allegiance or obligation to that constituency group. Right before election night, there was an item on BBC with Martin Amis and Ann Coulter debating the upcoming election. She said Trump's going to win tomorrow. Amis didn't seem to think so. But he said, it's been a terrible effect Donald Trump has had on the American people because people have become disinhibited by what Trump has said. Now, what did that mean? That meant people felt free to say what they were thinking. Ann Coulter thought that was a good thing. But what's more important in terms of the Trump effect is that is actually the definition of a liberating effect. If you're freed, you're liberated. So people have not been disinhibited. People have been liberated. Or you could say people have been encouraged. In other words, they've been given the courage to express themselves. Because previously people had been inhibited, which means they've been intimidated. And that means we had been living in a very intimidating environment where people were afraid to speak. Well, that's not the definition of a free society. That's the definition of a fear society. Nathan Sharansky gave some book to Bush right after 9/11, Fear Societies versus Free Societies. Well, the net result of Bush's response to 9/11 and Obama's was to turn the United States into a fear society, where people were afraid to speak, to say the wrong thing. They were afraid somebody would be reading their emails. Somebody would be listening to their phone calls. They were afraid people would be overhearing what they said in restaurants. They were afraid if they said one wrong thing at work, they would lose their job. Well, what country does that sound like? It sounds like the former Soviet Union. It sounds like fascist Italy or Nazi Germany. It does not sound like the land of the free and the home of the brave. And Trump's actual ability to speak freely and not back down encourages people and liberates them, and they go, hey, if he can do it, I can do it too. Because if you read any of the literature on totalitarianism, whether Arthur Koestler's Darkness at Noon, or George Orwell's 1984, or even Aldous Huxley's Brave New World, it only takes one person who you can see standing up to the authorities to encourage many, many others. So that also is sort of interesting. Trump, far from being a Hitler figure, is a liberator. And you can even say that Twitter plays into that, because one of the things about Twitter was, here was this mechanism which was used by the United States for the so-called color revolutions around the world and for the so-called Arab Spring, that, we're going to mobilize the people using Twitter. And Trump came and said, hey, we can have a Twitter revolution right here in the United States. I'll just tweet. And he just did it. So it's like the Nike ad, just do it. He just did it. And when people said he did it, I mean, it got to the point that Twitter started censoring people. It wasn't actually a business decision, it was a political decision. But it's very interesting because they tried to censor Trump, but they couldn't. So he showed one guy can get away with it. Because up until Trump, everybody had somehow been shut up. But Trump wasn't shut up. So he went on to become president. Now other people go, I can be free too. So I think that is also the Trump effect, as a liberating effect. Political correctness, you want to talk about the universities, which has been dominant in the universities, say at least since 1987 till today, for the first time has somebody in a position of authority who is willing to say, in the words of La Pasionaria, no pasaran. I mean, everything's been sort of reversed. The revolutionary, the liberator, is Trump. The oppressor is all the establishment in the United States, which no doubt is very similar to the nomenclatura in the former Soviet Union before Boris Yeltsin and the collapse of communism. So I think that is a way of understanding what Trump represents in that sort of effect vis-a-vis PC. Like Reagan, Trump is a media personality. He came out of television. He had a series, The Celebrity Apprentice. He's lived his life as a celebrity. He's been on Lifestyles of the Rich and Famous. He was on the front page of the New York Post when he was young, part of the Studio 54 crowd, glamorous, high life. I think it'd be a natural for the media to embrace. He's had provided a lot of copy, a lot of newspaper editors over the years. But strangely, despite being an actual celebrity himself, the celebrities turned against him. Now why? Well, it's the same thing. He's a dissident. He's gone against the orthodoxy. He's like as if he were a Communist Party member who left the party. That's the worst possible thing you can be, is somebody who knows them and rejects them. he's like a former member of the cult who left the cult. And nobody is more to be despised than a former cult member who turns on you. I mean, this was true of ex-communists, it's true of ex-Scientologists, it's true of ex-Hare Krishna, it's true of ex-Moonies, whoever. The person who leaves the cult is a danger to the whole cult because it shows you can survive without the cult. So what do you need to be in the cult for in the first place? Well, maybe if I'm in the media, I don't have to be a leftist, you know? Well, that won't do. So I think that's part of the reason, is the cult nature of the media. The second thing with the media is they're very politically correct in general. And just by not being politically correct, he creates an irritation. And in a way, it's interesting because they can't ignore him. The normal thing is you just ignore people. I mean, how many pictures has Augustine made and how many of them have been shown on television? You know, none. And what, a dozen. And the reason is you don't exist if you're not part of the party, so to speak. But with Trump, he can't be ignored because he has billions of dollars, he has hotels, he can buy time. And they tried all the usual things. They took away the Miss Universe pageant, boycotted his ties at Macy's, basically tried to make life impossible, and he just kept going. So they tried to have boycotts of his hotels, but it didn't stop him. So the usual tricks didn't work, and that's another reason the media is against him. Again, you have to put on your cap. If the media were just a business, and he gets ratings, and he gets copy, and he gets attention, and he's an entertainer, and he's a celebrity, and people watch, what's wrong with that? Why not give him more airtime? Why not praise him? Why not celebrate him? Because their view is, we made you, we can break you. Well, we'll see. Maybe they didn't make him. Maybe he had another identity due to his real estate empire, and maybe they can't break him. I mean, and we'll see what happens. That's has yet to be determined. But I would give him a pretty good shot. The other thing about the media that's sort of interesting is these days, the media, you know, he didn't get any major newspaper endorsements. He didn't get any endorsements from any media outlets, really. A handful you can count on a few fingers. Their authority and legitimacy is sort of on the line. And what happened, what changed was newspapers used to be aimed at everybody. The whole idea was something for everyone. Even the New York Times had genuine op-eds that were opposed to their editorials. The op-eds were published because of Mobil Corporation paying for the op-ed page during the first OPEC boycott. But they had William Safire, who really did work for Nixon and really was more conservative than your average columnist in the New York Times.